my project is on refugees and refugee camps in the First World War in Austria-Hungary, so it's quite different than the book. But when Yanis pitched this presentation, he suggested I actually talk about the book because it fits with Recept and with ideas of transformation. And it made me think a bit about how I'm bringing the idea of transformation to this story as much as possible. And this is exactly what my angle will be today in my presentation, as I will reflect on ways the case of foreign aid and its relationship with state making in general marks an era of transformations in the interwar period in East Central Europe in general. And I focus, of course, on interwar Romania as my case study. So I'm going to actually talk a bit about the book. It has some sort of cover, I guess. I'd like to, so this book is coming later this year with Stanford University Press. It's been a long time coming. Don't get me started. But this is what the concept is. It is the relationship between foreign aid and state building in this interwar period. And I actually used the title of the book for my presentation today. Just to give you a bit of context, various aid organizations, primarily American, so this is also a very American story, arrived in Romania with the goal of relieving suffering populations after the destruction of the First World War. Once the war ended, for these organizations, foreign aid also meant rehabilitation, modernization of states and societies perceived as inherently backward. And I'll actually explain later on what I mean by that. And however, this is the big point of the book, and this is what I actually tried desperately to do. I didn't want to tell a story about American organizations going to a country. I wanted to talk about aid that is not, the story of aid is not one directional and deeply civilizing in this country of reception. There are multiple dynamics at stake. And this takes me to the kind of the two-faceted argument of the book. And the first one is that Romanian state builders actively pursued, accessed, and instrumentalized American humanitarian and philanthropic aid to advance their own aspirations and domestic endeavors of post-war reconstruction modernization during a time of social, political, and economic upheaval, that transformation, right? In the process, and this is the second part of my argument, foreign aid organizations in the period reinforced various nationalizing projects that defined aspirations of the making of a greater Romania. And I'll explain what I mean by that for those that are not experts on Romania. For the purposes of my talk today, I would even add that this is a story, that this is a study, this study is a reflection on ways an era of transformation, such as the one after the First World War and the 2 decades after, shaped agendas of foreign aid more broadly, molded aspirations of state building in Romania and East Central Europe in general, and framed their eventual intertwining. So what do I mean by this? And I would like to talk a bit about what I mean by state building in here and in this book, and what I mean by foreign aid, and how I reflect about connections in this East Central European space and in this period in particular. I know there are some students also looking at this, that's why I have to give a bit of context. I think this is important, right? Okay, this is a bit of a juvenile map, but I think it makes the point. But I like to talk about this state building at the beginning from the perspective of the first Czechoslovak president, Tomáš Masaryk, who famously claimed that Europe was, and I'm going to quote here, a laboratory atop of a mass graveyard after the First World War. I use this this quote in my introduction because it's very, I think it says a lot. But state leaders like Masaryk and other policymakers in the region contended with new geopolitical and social configurations in East Central Europe and the challenges they posed after the war and after the imperial collapse in Europe, which led to redrawing of borders. In this context, creating institutions of governance as well as managing and at times the ideas of fixing or controlling populations, their numbers, their ethnicity, their representation, their way of life. So all this emerged as a backbone of what I call here state building. In Romania, the war and the transformation of its borders, you see it here, and thus the creation of a changed nation state shaped the thinking of how governance should look like and what that should be about. It also meant a shifting context regarding the social and ethnic fabric of the nation within the boundaries of the state. So to briefly contextualize the story of Romania, very, very briefly, the Kingdom of Romania, dark green, here, entered the war in 1916 with a very explicit idea of uniting all provinces and regions where Romanians inhabited, often under the foreign rule, often under European empires. So ultimately, there was this idea of a union with long lost territories and a triumph of sovereignty from European empires. And these were in many ways, the ideological lines of Romanian belligerence in 1916. So Romania enters the war 2 years after it starts. It was a gamble. It was considered, even over 100 years later, it was considered a gamble that succeeded as the Allies, including Romania, won the war. European empires collapsed, and Romania, of course, united. The Kingdom of Romania united with provinces previously under the imperial rule, adding the yellowish green, I don't know, Transylvania, Banat, Crișana, Bucovina, and Bessarabia. The union of all provinces in 1918 was therefore a moment of transformation, right? And brought opportunities for a national redefining. The question of establishing a national identity through the strengthening of a Romanian national consciousness in this enlarged Greater Romania, which was a site of multi-ethnic, multi-linguistic populations, informed politics and policies of the period. This meant assimilation of minorities, various policies of Romanianization of territories that joined after 1918, the unification of economic systems of unequal capabilities across provinces. There was this idea that the East, the Old Kingdom, was actually less developed than Transylvania that had been in the Austro-Hungarian monarchy. And all of this, the centralization of state institutions that are all part of the state building process in this period. So, but I want to emphasize that the creation of the ideal Greater Romania did not mean only formally establishing a sovereign nation state. It also meant addressing political, social, and economic challenges posed by the war destruction and the Union itself. Post-war reconstruction. So this is a country that was at war. It was destroyed, right? So reconstructing this country also entailed the establishment of central institutions and bureaucracies that would achieve economic advancement and foster administrative integration, cultural consolidation and assimilation, and this legislative harmonization across provinces. It also meant the transformation of the agrarian nature of the Romanian state and then negotiation, let's say, of the rural-urban divide in this period. Given this context we have a context of political ambitions meshing with the realities of a frail nation state at stake. So in the next 2 decades after the Union, various state builders attempted to strengthen the sovereignty and autonomy of this newly formed Greater Romania, try to ensure a strong national identity of the population, but also engineer this post-war reconstruction period efforts and to conceptualize and implement modernizing projects. Transformation was politically wanted, but it was also a challenge. Also an opportunity in many ways from the perspective of Romanian state builders. And I actually talk about various Romanian state builders in the book. And I'll explain later what I mean by that. Going into kind of another part of this context, the era of the First World War and the interwar period, yes, there were moments of transformation in terms of the emergence of new nation states in Central Europe, but only changed nation states after the collapse of European empire. So Romania is a case of a changed nation state, okay? It's not a new state. So yes, it is about national stories, but it is also, of course, a moment of transformation at the international level. The events of the war, the fact that it actually even happened, led to the making or attempts to create international forms of governance with different capabilities. And I mean here the creation, for example, of the League of Nations. That was created in this name of peacemaking. We got to make sure that this is not happening anymore, right? However, this era also represents a watershed in the development of professional and non-governmental aid for civilians. Okay, the concept of foreign aid has mostly been associated with post-1948 development aid. And I use actually the concept quite intentionally in the book and in my research to emphasize the ideas that helping and ultimately trying to improve the distant others did not emerge in this era of the Second World War and after. So in this book, I primarily look at non-state or quasi-non-state and civilian-centric foreign aid in this era of the First World War. I would like to note, okay, that I do not suggest that what I'm looking at is the singular type of foreign aid. International assistance has had multiple colors in different locales and different moments in time. It's been political, diplomatic, technological, logistical, targeting both civilians and combatants. But here with this book, and hopefully I can join a chorus of scholars who alert of the First World War as a moment of change in terms of assistance for civilians. So in the project itself, I look at foreign aid through the lens of humanitarian organizations, as well as philanthropy. And I look specifically at American organizations. This is not by chance. The foreign aid organizations were America. Europe was in tatters. So this is a moment when the United States becomes kind of this big power, right? And aid is one way to kind of implement this big power status. So it was the largest and most influential aid agents they were driven by claimed moral compass, if you will, but they also brought the professionalization, the technocratic element to aid. So I want to emphasize that this is the moment when aid becomes technocratic, professional. You see aid givers, doctors, nurses, part of these organizations. Okay. So humanitarian organizations, first and foremost, operated at first with the idea of quickly helping people to eat, have clothing, improve health. So this is a very traditional way of thinking of humanitarianism. But it also changed from an emergency, from the war to the peacetime, to a more rehabilitative approach where concerns regarding medium and long-term bodily development, capacity to work, education entered the humanitarian vernacular at the time. Once the crisis of war subsided and humanitarian organizations exited various territories they operated in, we have the case of American philanthropy, particularly through a small organization called the Rockefeller Foundation that really grows at this time. And this organization, as a philanthropic organization, takes center stage. The immediacy of relief was largely abandoned. Okay, so from humanitarianism, you have the more reconstructive, constructive form of aid. But what do we mean by philanthropy? It meant support for technical development, creation of a human material infrastructure, institutionalization of knowledge production. And by that, I mean, you see funding for sociologists, for example, for doctors, for medical practitioners in various institutions that were emerging at the time, and particularly in areas that were perceived to be backward. So you see this kind of idea of a civilizing mission of aid time and time again. And I would say that this is proto-developmental thinking at play here before 1948, okay? So, and in the story, Central and Eastern Europe, East Central Europe, if you want, matters. The transformation of the nature of foreign aid throughout this post-war and interwar period met with the transformations of East Central Europe and the East Central European nation states in general. So I argue in my book, and I'd like to argue today, that American aid organizations, whether humanitarian or philanthropic, had multiple motivations to provide assistance in East Central Europe. First, yes, this is a deeply destroyed region of Europe. You see war sufferers, poverty, illness, homelessness, or displacement that influenced the turn of these organizations to this region, okay? We gotta pay attention to these people. If during the war, Italy and France actually had the most aid, once the war ends, there is this turn to East Central Europe more prominently. Particularly, for example, it was the pain of children in these affected areas that mobilized leadership of humanitarian organizations across the region. And this is actually what I'm going to talk. I'm going to give an example of how I'm thinking about these topics through the lens of war orphans later on in the presentation. So humanitarians, for example, wrote of the starving Hungarian child, of the young and unspoiled Polish girls, as motivators to mobilize aid for these states post-war and post-empire reconstruction. Actually, this picture is from a collection of the American Red Cross in Poland. So it's a milk station in Poland. Second of all, aid givers looked at the rather weak sovereignty and the post-war political feebleness of the new and newly expanded states of this region. I argue, and there are other scholars who argue this, that aid organizations thrived on this moment of transformation and on the weakness and the need of their recipient nations. This weakness stemmed not only from the material destruction of the war, so the more organic element of it, but also from this transitional period that we have in this post-empire existence. American humanitarians and philanthropists became convinced of the power of their aid programs to strengthen frail institutions in this region, political as well. They believed that it was through their aid that East Central Europe would be able to strengthen their newly acquired autonomy. So from their point of view, people of this region could refute the potential spread of Bolshevism of uncivilized Bolshevism, I would say, German militarism, revolution, chaos, and instability, as long as they had access to food, medicine, and other forms of financial and material aid. We have to feed them, so we make sure that there's no anarchy. Okay, so people are happy, and we make sure in this way that institutions are not attacked at the social level, right? So the third point, okay, there's this debate whether this matters in the story. I think it matters. I don't think it's the central part of the story, but I think it matters because potential economic capacity of East Central European states was important for various American leaders and representatives of these organizations. Yes, feeding populations was one thing, and you want to make sure, yes, you avoid anarchy. These people are fine, but having commerce with this region was appealing as well. So making sure these countries thrive had potential for various, in the political language of aid and for these organizations. And lastly, American aid givers believed in the civilizational powers of their actions in this region. Leaders of various organizations considered the people of East Central European countries to be more backward than white Americans or Western Europeans. They believe these countries are firstly deeply affected by wars, events, and destruction, and in need of aid to depart from flawed imperial and Germanic influences. There are ideas of backward Slavs, particularly when it comes to the Balkan region, or poor Ottoman influences. And all these ideas appear time and time again in various archives that are produced by American humanitarian philanthropic organizations. They relied on what I would call a fundamentally Orientalist trope of the region and its people, deemed too backward because much of their history. And so, yes, these people had been long under the Ottoman Empire, for example, or other empires, so they didn't really have autonomy, and now they're learning. So we have this power to really help them find their way in this moment of transformation by giving them food and medicine and teaching people how to manage these resources. So there was this idea that, okay, as a humanitarian, I'm going to bring American progressive values to this really backward and uncivilized corner of the world. Okay, the case of Romania in the broader narrative of interwar American aid, I would say, is fundamentally unexceptional. Okay, maybe I'm not pitching this in the best way, but I think it's important to say this. This was one country out of many in East Central Europe where American humanitarians and philanthropists landed with ambitions to quickly help war-suffering populations, but also to transform these backward societies, as I had just mentioned. But my scope here is not to claim the uniqueness of the Romanian case and the American story of aid, but I propose a focus on one case study to explore one key question, and this, let's say, my research question, as I tell my students: how are American aid, its actors and its practices received in East Central Europe at a time when the countries of the region were undergoing their own processes of socio-political and economic transformation? I'm aware I just used the passive voice, not very good, but I wanted to give this as, I wanted to kind of present this in the most, in a fairly vague way, because I wanted to open the landscape of reception, okay? We don't really know who the recipients are at the beginning. So I wanted to, and did this on purpose. Okay, for the rest of my presentation, I would like to zoom in on one specific case of humanitarianism for war orphans, because I want to show through a case study a few dynamics that emerged out of this process of aid. The book itself has 4 thematic chapters, so I wanted to zoom in on one small story just to kind of give a sense of how I go about it and how I'm using everything that I just talked about. So, okay. In the interwar period, the fate of children emerged as key for the mobilization of international assistance schemes, as well as for various nationalizing state building agendas in this post-imperial East Central Europe, American humanitarians directed their peacetime action in particular into not only the saving, but also the shaping of Europe's future. So relieving children's hunger, homelessness, or illness was one thing. The rehabilitation through education and training for work became part of humanitarian's agenda. So as I mentioned earlier, children really become the quintessential objects of these various humanitarian organizations. Children's vulnerability fed into this urgency that drove an impressive amount of aid to Europe, and particularly in Europe's war zones, but it was also their malleability. And I played with this malleability element that was to determine the long-term impact of America's humanitarian mobilization at this time. And I think historian David Rodoniu posits it well, as it claims, and I want to quote him here: humanitarian institutions located suffering children outside the complications of history, where they would reincorporate once their own nation had experienced the civilizing work of humanitarians, end quote. When it came to locales in East Central Europe, child assistance meant strengthening, improvement, and professionalization of childcare institutions that would address children's war suffering, but would also entail a delivery of American values of self-help, efficiency, and cross-class solidarity. These are quotes from the various humanitarians to what they called half-civilized East Central Europe, end quote. So this idea of half-civilized East Central Europe is all over the archival material. Okay, so this is the story of the scale of humanitarian organizations, but also at the national level. When it comes to national politics, you see political elites, scientific experts, and intellectuals that theorized, legislated, and put into practice programs that placed children at the heart of post-war reconstruction and, more broadly, state building. The physical and moral development of children became linked to state legitimacy and the nation's military, social, and political strength. By 1930s, depopulation, declining birth rates, educational curricula, and institutionalization dominated discourses around children all over Europe. In East Central Europe, too, social care for children often became synonymous with policies of nationalization in response primarily to ethnic and cultural diversity. So child welfare became intensely politicized across the region. In Romania, the interwar period also saw an increased interest in the care of children whose post-war relief and overarching welfare meant the healthy growth of a nation. Before the war, I wanted to emphasize something. Before the war, issues of child welfare were a private matter. Various sanitary institutions may be attached to the Ministry of Internal Affairs would function around the care of children. However, there was little state intervention by and large. Most efforts to assist children came through private hospitals, local philanthropic initiatives, or churches. And at the time before the war, children's care was a matter of what we can call emergency relief, curing the sick, feeding them with soup, and so forth. But once the war takes place and we see kind of this state building process that's happening, we see a switch. Children's post-conflict vulnerability and their saving malleability were both collective and political. And we see aspects of cultural and educational policies or relief or policies of natalism targeting the child in general. So Romania was no different than other states that used control of population growth and improvement of children's lives as the highest measure of national power and prestige in the period. So in the eyes of various Romanian state builders, children represent the key for the making of the ideal nation. Okay. The state matters so in the story of child welfare. However, when I write and talk about the state builders in this book, I don't talk about only politicians and policymakers. In fact, I argue that it was during and after this moment of the First World War that we see a form of civil society emerging, and it's very relief-oriented. Wartime destruction, suffering created a backdrop of the birth and growing proactive work of various domestic philanthropies, associations, formal institutions that were involved in this post-war reconstruction. These were established or managed by various elites, many of whom were women, so we can actually put this story also in the history of gender. So these institutions became part of a domestic network of philanthropy and tackled various forms of human suffering. And in practice, they targeted the spread of disease, various hunger crises, the immediacy of the plight of war-suffering children, but also importantly, and I want to emphasize this, and I will show this, the language of state consolidation and the need of the strengthening of a Romanian nation become part of the vernacular of this emerging civil society. And this is rather evident in the case of assistance for war orphans. European societies in general noted the particular suffering of war orphans as their fate became crucial to how nations and states would survive, construct, or reconstruct after the conflict ended. In Romania, the war left up to 400,000 children without one or both parents. So it is not surprising that the fate of war orphans became a social and even political matter, and rather poignantly so. Orphans assistance was, at first, I would argue there was rather an incoherent social policy in the immediate period of after the war. And this can be maybe, I would say, explained through the lens of various deficiencies in terms of infrastructure and economic capacity. The issue was, however, also a matter of political debate, and I've I read actually quite a lot of documents about debates in the parliament. What should we do about war orphans? It was a big problem. So by 1920, after all this debating, there was a state-funded national office for war invalids, widows, and orphans was established in 1920. So, but the year 1919 matters to me and matters here because this is indeed a period of transition, a period of transformation, and a moment when various Romanian elites requested foreign aid to sustain orphan care at a time of feeble state institutions and limited capacity to aid orphans. So in this moment of 1919, this is where my chronology around the story is. So at this point we see foreign aid is an option, okay? So one such request came from Queen Marie of Romania to the American Red Cross. This is Queen Marie, and this is a picture from the American Red Cross, actually. And there's like you see the Red Cross. By that point, the American Red Cross was one of the largest humanitarian organizations involved in Europe. At first, France and Italy were the biggest aid programs. But again, once the war ends, there is a turn to Central and Eastern Europe, Poland, for example, and Romania, getting the most aid, and I would say Hungary as well. Frederica Kinkovac wrote a fantastic book on Budapest children and this kind of mobilization around children in Hungary. Before the war, I wanted to emphasize something. The American Red Cross had worked mostly within the United States, but once the war starts and there's destruction in Europe, they look abroad. And it grows at impressive speed. Their $400 million was their budget during the war. But so the American Red Cross really becomes kind of this big thing, and had already worked in Romania quite limitedly, but worked a bit with a small mission that arrived in Romania in 1917. But once the war ends, Queen Marie frames her request to the American Red Cross by claiming internal capacity to respond to need and singling out America's aid as a necessary path in Romania's quest for reconstruction. This is what she says. No country, so this she writes to the American Red Cross. No country, as well as America, could assist us in this difficult task. Her wonderful sense of organization, the admirable devotion of her workers, her splendid spirit of altruism, her never-failing desire to uphold, console, and lead forward, added to her unlimited material resources, give her a power that no other possesses. We have no more than 325,000 war orphans. Numbers are still to be debated, to care for, schools to build, hospitals to organize and equip. Who could better aid us than the American people? End quote. Marie's words reinforced ties between Romanian state leadership and American humanitarians. But it also fed into American Red Cross's goals once peace was settled. As I mentioned, during the war, American Red Cross had a fantastic budget, but once the war ends, the interest really is not there anymore. And they actually depended on charity and donations. So once the war ends, their projects become smaller and have a smaller scale. So that's why they end up focusing mostly on children. So it's not just, okay, everyone's suffering, but mostly in children. And they tried to develop a child health program for Eastern Europe. So in this framework, it gave a special importance to the care of Romanian orphans after the war. And this was evident in an essay written by one Robert Olds. Okay, I don't want you to occupy your minds with the names, but he was the American Red Cross Commissioner to Europe, and he wrote an essay about the very specific necessity of child relief work in Romania. And I'd like to give a few quotes from this essay because I think it gives an insight into the overall thinking of humanitarians at this point. Olds described the plight of children in this country and their relief as pressing problems, calling for immediate action. Okay, I have a quote here. If the youth of Romania is to be preserved for her future development. Small indeed is the prospect of the child where their only food is cabbage roots or bread made from bran and twigs of trees chopped up together, end quote. He described the situation as by far the most difficult problem in Romania, so children's situation, because the reports the American Red Cross had noted that up to 80% of children in some villages had died. Olds interpret this as caused by health and hygiene issues, tuberculosis and pellagra particularly, and he was concerned about the immediate effects of epidemics and disease in general. But he also considered children's sickness to endanger, I think, I forgot to put this on the slide, the integrity of the race. Okay, so this is actually the quote he uses. And in this sense, echoes a turn to positive eugenics that hadn't been embedded in American humanitarians in general and for children specifically. In practical terms, the American Red Cross organized a special department of orphanages in Romania. And this was an institution that had been involved in orphans' food relief as nutritious food, such as bacon, cod liver oil, and condensed milk. So I'm sorry, but it's a very American diet, right? So bringing this food to these Romanian children meant that they actually would have a better nutrition. The American Red Cross started a campaign of supply to local charitable institutions in cities and adjoining territories through the Department of Orphanages. And this was a humanitarian effort that was later on described as one of the best records accomplished in Central Europe. So it's considered a success story in the headquarters of the American Red Cross, at least. However, as I mentioned, American Red Cross efforts to aid orphans in post-war Romania also coincided with the waning of the organization's popularity in the US and the waning of its financial capacity and the general direction in peacetime. So this is important because instead of establishing their very own institution in Romania, the American Red Cross was bound to expand its work primarily through collaboration with domestic associations that were part of this emerging civil society. And this is actually what I'm arguing at this point. The most prominent domestic collaborator of the American Red Cross in Romania in terms of aid for orphans was one organization called, the Society for the Protection of War Orphans. This is my translation from Romanian. This was established in 1916. Its target was to own land, build orphanages, acquire clothing, food, and access to medical care for children. So it comes out of the destruction of war and the concern for what's happening with children of this nation, of this potentially bigger nation. So the society established more than 50 orphanages in 2 years of the war that housed over 4,500 orphans during these 2 years. But once the conflict ended and the union took place, it expanded in all counties of the country, including in the new provinces. This is important, okay? So it becomes kind of like a deeply national organization. I mentioned earlier that there is a language of nation and state building involved in this, in this kind of part of this civil society. And I wanted to show you here what the mandate of the Society for the Protection of War Orphans said. The country and the nation have the duty to care for children, for them, raise them, teach them, develop their characters to make of them hardworking and honest citizens worthy of the sacrifice of their parents. End quote. In the process, the mandate claimed an inclusivity of this orphan care as a noted protection of all orphans, regardless of religion, legitimacy, naturalization, and recognition. So this is also part of the mandate. Okay, now we have little, if any, information on the ethnic composition of various orphanages in Romania's provinces. However, I'd like to note historian Maria Bucur here, who noted, actually in her own studies on this, that the preference for this organization remained firmly on the regions with an ethnically Romanian majority. Okay, so I'm using Maria Bucur's research on this. Take her word for granted. American Red Cross humanitarians consider the language and the practice of relief of the Society of Protection of War Orphans to be in sync with the ways they also envisioned priorities of child assistance in general. So American Red Cross says, okay, these guys are great. These ladies are great. Their reports regarding the orphan care through the society were full of admiration. They were particularly impressed with the relief work given to over 11,000 orphans by 1919, who were, and I quote, properly fed and clothed, and their physical well-being looked after, end quote. The American Red Cross funds that had already been sent to the, during the war to some members of these of this association, of the society, were reportedly used with economic discretion. And the overall work of the Society for the Protection of War Orphans indicated, and quote from the American Red Cross archives, a great national as well as humanitarian service as being splendidly done, end quote. The women who managed orphanages in the province were explicitly deemed noble and self-sacrificing women of Romania. Again, this is the perspective of American humanitarians. It is important to note that the various notes of appraisal regarding domestic-driven relief work for orphans was in many ways at odds with the recurrent accusations of backwardness found in American accounts regarding their experience in Romania and East Central Europe in general. Rather, to me, that was quite a shift in language, because it showed me that this is a proactive presence of Romanian domestic relief workers in the overall process of aid for war orphans in the post-war period. Confident in the established collaboration with the Society for the Protection of War Orphans, the American Red Cross leaders and humanitarians on the ground who drafted a program of rehabilitation in Romania. This program represented an articulation once more of American models of child welfare, which was meant to be transferred to Romania, which all of a sudden this becomes an ideal site of aid reception. So what I mean by that, as I have already mentioned, there is this mix of urgency of relief that at this point was supposed to be left behind, and the American Red Cross leaders of the mission framed their long-term projections in Romania in terms of reconstruction of the race and the reestablishment of personal morale, and quote, they believe that if properly handled, quote, these children, many of whom are the brightest in the country, can be made an asset to the state instead of a liability, end quote. Agriculture, industrial work, and domestic science were among the key sectors that the American Red Cross workers were convinced they could impact in this, they can impact in this rural country. So more, and all this in collaboration with the Society for the Protection of War Orphans. More emergency relief measures in a healthcare and nursing training school for girls were also part of this rehabilitation program as part of its education-oriented relief for orphans. The transfer of American models of infrastructure investment for building hospitals and teaching institutions became the practical end goal of the organization in Romania. So through this, the American Red Cross aimed to establish their early area of educational relief and aimed to, and I'm going to give a quote here, enrich and above all to make a permanent our contribution to Europe. So there's this idea, okay, if we do this rehabilitative programs, they're going to have medium and long-term success. We're going to live our, we're going to have an impact in the long term in this rural part of Europe. So in this context, the Society for Protection of War Orphans impressed, okay? So it was exactly what this society in Romania was doing as well. And I have these pictures here, particularly from a booklet of the society that show quite explicitly that it also engaged in educational relief based on gender distinctions. So we have some examples here. Boys benefited from agricultural schooling, whereas girls were taught practical ways to maintain a household or develop professional tracks such as teachers, midwives, or nurses. And all this is under the umbrella of the society. This Romanian approach to education drew the attention and the admiration of the American Red Cross workers. Humanitarians were chiefly attentive to the small farms, intensive agriculture, and the management of extensive farming operation, as well as the education of girls, once more through nursing, domestic science, and other occupations needed in the development of Romania. And this is actually the quote they were using. So on this basis, we see here the American Red Cross turning to the Society for the Protection of War Orphans as the best way to deal with these needy children, and aiding the society in developing its work was what was expected. And in my interpretation, okay, oops, I forgot the quote here. As far as the American Red Cross representatives were concerned, the Romanian domestic associations for children's care represented a fertile arena for American humanitarian efforts, but also integrated in the local ownership of relief and rehabilitation. And this is my interpretation. So what is the deal on the Romanian side? Romanian elites who worked for orphan assistance saw the American Red Cross aid as an advantageous addition to their plans. For example, the American Red Cross archives are full of requests from various local establishments of the Society for the Protection of War Orphans, asking for medical material and professional support, and particularly to the American Red Cross offices in Romania. I was thinking of showing this, but they're very small and they're not very clear. But I use that as an archive, as a archival material, these requests. Okay, what do they tell me? I do have another instance of how this American Red Cross aid was interpreted among these elites involved in orphan care. And this is, I'm going to mention here the case of Alexandrina Cantacuzină, who was the president of the National Orthodox Society of Romanian Women. There's a long history of her. There are some great people working on her as a character, but This was another Romanian association that partially targeted orphan care in this period and was keen on any potential American Red Cross assistance that the organization was willing to undertake. So Cantacuzino actually looked at the possibility for aid in issues of child health, especially. For instance, in reacting to information that the American Red Cross was interested in establishing a foundation with the purpose to help the orphans of the war. So that was an idea that was circulated. Cantacuzino proposed the creation of a sanatorium of 300 to 500 beds where the sick orphans can get all the care of modern science. So I see here a Romanian philanthropist adopting the language of modernization that American humanitarians would bring to Romania. So to me, that's okay, there's something there. So Cantacuzino's enthusiasm for medical aid, an area that Romanian institutions were notably lacking in terms of resources, however, did not have the response that she was hoping. She repeatedly requested the American Red Cross to take over medical relief. Local commissioners of American Red Cross mission in Romania, however, insisted that all work should be Romanian and therefore insisted on the idea of self-help. And it takes me to the idea that American humanitarianism was working on the basis of helping others to help themselves. And this is actually quite explicitly brought back in the Second World War, but this is what I want to note. So through its Department of Orphanages, the institution that I mentioned earlier, the American Red Cross assisted various institutions across the country against epidemics, provided medical supplies and basic training of nurses under the supervision of American personnel. However, as the relief work came to an end, the organization's leadership in Romania concluded that the best work the American Red Cross could undertake in that country was to relieve war orphans through aiding the Romanians themselves in their existing endeavors, and in the establishing of the industrial home for training war orphans and children in general. So by 1920, the Department of Orphanages became an exit program for the American Red Cross mission, as its resources were also practically exhausted. So the choice of the American Red Cross representatives to simply assist existing associations and initiatives enabled a local ownership of orphan aid and ultimately diminished the exposure of the American organization itself at this point in time. Generally, and I have to be transparent about this, little can be found in existing Romanian sources specifically about the American Red Cross's work to relieve and rehabilitate Romania's orphans in the immediate aftermath of the war. One possible explanation, and I'm saying this, is that Romanians perceive the American Red Cross's relief work as only an extension of existing domestic efforts. Alexandrina Cantacuzino's, for example, requests for specific medical work suggest that domestic philanthropists conceive the relief and eventual rehabilitation of children as a Romanian effort, sustained, but not revolutionized by American actors. A publication commissioned by the Society for the Protection of War Orphans, where I got these pictures from, regarding its origins and development through the 1920s, makes no mention of American assistance and collaborations after the war. Overall, the story of the American Red Cross and its assistance of Romania's orphans suggests that early on, domestic efforts and institutions actively and purposely integrated post-war child aid. Romanian elites involved in a network of philanthropy saw the American organization's assistance and its integration into their domestic channels of orphan care. At the same time, the American Red Cross's work, debilitated by the lack of support and finance at home in many ways, found in Romania an arena where domestic philanthropy, civil society, relief-oriented civil society on behalf of children had developed to a level that, from American humanitarians' point of view, allowed the close cooperation and assistance of locally driven projects. I would say here, orphan care ultimately became a transnational product of domestic agendas and foreign aid that sustained the homegrown establishment and development of child relief and rehabilitation. Now, to conclude all of this, the interwar period represented a moment of crystallization of professionalized assistance for suffering civilians, either because of extended belligerence or as a consequence of poverty, feeble welfare institutions, or perceived backwardness of recipient nations. US originating humanitarianism abroad meant to address the destruction of war, but once the peace settled across Europe, the emergency nature of aid giving transformed into an explicit diffusion of seeming American liberal values. In this context, at the time, Central European states emerged as ideal places where medium and long-term agendas of assistance could come alive. Yes, they were destroyed by war, they were economically frail, institutionally weak, socially combustible, caught in between Soviet and Bolshevik expansion and German militarism, rural and poor. This is the perspective from the American organizations. But how did their East Central European recipients perceive American aid? Takes me back to the initial research question. What was its place in the state building process that marked the period after the First World War? So for the case of Romania, my book looks at these shifts in terms of foreign aid processes. It's a messy story in many ways. And as seen in the briefly mapped case of humanitarianism or orphans, I did not seek to write a story of successes or failures. American humanitarians might consider their story a success or a failure. But to me, this is a story of how the local context shaped, sometimes challenged, but often eased the implementation of foreign aid givers' ambitions and agendas. In the end, for Romanian state builders, foreign aid was a potent alternate avenue to bolster the long question of their visions of a greater Romania idea.